decent paper becomes part of your image, and it helps, it enhances, it encourages you, it makes the colour glow and flow. Whereas the bad stuff, well, it's like painting on toilet paper, and it's depressing, and it fights you, and it makes you want to give up, and it makes you think that it's all your fault, and it isn't, it's the paper. Why did no one ever tell me about how important watercolour paper is? I see students coming into class and they're clutching a pad of hideous stuff, and I know it's going to be depressing. I know it's going to fight them all the way. So I want to encourage you to get some decent stuff. I'm going to show you a few examples of the good and the bad, just so you can see the difference, and so that you know that I'm not in the pay of some paper mill trying to con you into spending more money. Changing your paper will enhance your painting beyond belief. It's true. So my name's Liz Chaderton. I'm a professional watercolour artist based in Berkshire, and every week I try and bring you a tip, trick or technique that I wish I'd known about ages ago. And this week it's all about paper. It's worth thinking why our paper is quite so important. And just looking at this pen and wash of a sheep just shows you why. The white of the paper becomes our lightest colour, it becomes our white. So the paper surface is usually really visible in any watercolour painting. It's not like a canvas where you can slap a whole load of oil paint or acrylic over the top of it and you can't even see the texture. We can see bare paper everywhere. A good watercolour paper will let your colours really glow. The light will go through your transparent paints and bounce back, and everything will vibrate. It'll let you do lovely blends of colours effortlessly, and it'll let you have crisp lines and soft edges. So the quality of your paper is more important than the quality of your paints or the point on your brush, and yet everyone always worries about that. I think you can paint a really good painting with quite poor quality paints on a decent paper, whereas you can have the best paints in the world and on a poor quality paper you're stuffed. And just to prove my point, I have put swatches of the same colours on 4 different bits of watercolour paper, and I think you can see pretty immediately that they are all very different. Let's just choose a couple. So this is on Bockingford, which is what I usually use, and this is on something, I'm not even going to say the name just to save its blushes. I mean, you can see the difference in the colour of the paper, so that's one thing, but you can see the difference in the brightness of the paint samples. Where it will be very telling is if we try and lift some of this colour and see what happens to the paper surface. Now, I've used some very staining colours that naturally sink into the paper. So let's see, this is phthalo blue, and I've got some damp magic eraser to see how much I can lift of it. Now, I'm not expecting to be able to lift a huge amount because, as I say, this is a staining colour. And you saw me just do a few rubs backwards and forwards, and I've certainly lifted some colour. I'm now going to try on here, and I have lifted some colour, but I don't know if you can see that the surface has started to bobble up. It's like a woolly jumper, and it's started to pill. Whereas this surface is still flat. And then let me show you this paper. I bought this paper when I started painting a long time ago because it was on special offer and it's nice and thick, and I thought, ooh, I'll get some of that. That's a very good price. it's disgusting. Can you see how strong the pattern is? It's very linear, so that you're fighting the texture, but also just look at the colour difference. Particularly say, let's compare these two blues and how faded and dull it is. Even though the paper itself is probably quite similar in its sort of creaminess, what it does to the colour is just horrible. And in fact, it's even more marked on this purple, this dioxin purple. This has got a lovely glow to it, whereas this is dull and flat. Right, let's give you some pointers about what to look for. Ooh, look, late afternoon sunshine, how nice. So watercolour paper comes in 3 textures. You have hot press, which is very smooth. There's hardly any texture on that surface. And that's great if you're going to do detailed work like botanical painting or very detailed, say, pen and wash. But it does make it hard to control the water and the paint on the surface because it doesn't absorb into the paper and it skids around, and you may end up with funny hard lines and blotches. At the other end of the spectrum, let's choose one. There's rough, which hardly surprisingly, it has a rough texture, and that's great for very expressive work where you want the paper to show through the paint, and you've got dips and troughs, and it's great for things like landscapes. And somewhere in the middle you have what we either call knot, N-O-T, or cold press. That's one and the same thing, and that's got some texture but not as much as rough, and it's called cold press or knot because it is not hot pressed. The hot press goes through hot rollers to iron it flat. Cold press goes through cold rollers so it doesn't get that ironing. We usually have watercolour paper in white or a slightly off-white creamy colour, but you can get it in tints as well, and that would set the overall mood of your painting. Paper doesn't tend to come in a really bright white because the artificial whiteners that you would have to add to make it bright white do break down in UV light, so it will yellow over time. So that's why watercolour papers tend to be slightly creamy. Something to note on the texture is that it really varies from one manufacturer to another. What someone calls rough might be like cold press to another manufacturer. So you'll just have to look and see which you fancy. And then there's the weight. This is £90, which is 190 grams per square metre. And can you see it's relatively thin? But if we go at the other end of the spectrum, we've got £300, which is 638 grams per square metre, and that's like cardboard. Now, thin paper, if you put water on it, is likely to cockle and go bumpy as the fibres stretch and absorb the water. Thick paper won't. Thin paper is cheaper, thick paper more expensive. So I would suggest that the minimum you use without stretching is £140 if that's a relatively small painting that you're going to do. If you're doing a bigger painting with more water, go for heavier weight paper. What you're looking for is acid-free paper, or you might see it called archival. That means it will last 100 years without going yellow and without becoming brittle. What you might also want to look for is what it's actually made from, and watercolour paper can be made from wood, from cotton, or even from bamboo. I've never used bamboo, but that's a sort of ecological option. Cotton has longer fibres than wood, so the paper is stronger, but it's more expensive usually. I actually really like Bockingford, which is a cellulose paper. It's made from wood, but it is acid free. So don't discount cellulose paper. Next thing to think about is how you're going to buy it. Are you going to buy it in loose sheets, or in a spiral bound book, or even in a block where it is glued around the edge? Advantage of the block is that it will stay flat when you're painting on it, but both the pads and the blocks are more expensive than buying it as in sheets. Big advantage of sheets is that you can cut it to any size or shape that you want. Something you need to look for is what's called the sizing of your paper, and that is how the manufacturer sorts out the absorbency of the paper. It can be internally sized or externally sized. Traditionally, gelatin is used, so if you're vegetarian or vegan, you might want to look for alternatives. Nowadays, they sometimes use sort of PVC, PVA. Anyway, PV something, to size the paper. If it's internal, that happens in the manufacturing. If it's external, it's when it's finished. External sizing can be kind of worn off, or if you stretch your paper, it can be washed off. So some papers are internally and externally sized, and that sizing can break down with time. So if you've been storing paper, you may find it's blotchy when you try and put a wash on it, and that means your sizing has broken down. It shouldn't happen if you store your paper well, but if it's in high humidity, big temperature fluctuations, or exposed to acidic environment, then that can break down. And acidic can even be stored in contact with something like cardboard, because there's acid in the cardboard or the wood, and that can leach into the paper and break down the sizing. Hope that's given you a few pointers of what to look for, so you can find really good quality paper, hopefully it's still at an affordable price, and you will see your paintings absolutely transform.